As a punishment, a wealthy man forced his spoiled son to marry a modest farmer, but he was stunned by what his son did, something he never expected. Hi there, and welcome to Moonlit Stories channel. Thanks for tuning in. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. I think you're really going to love it. Alexander Peterson, a respected and influential businessman, paced back and forth in his office in New York City with a lump in his throat. From the windows of the tall building, the entire city was spread out like a map. However, his thoughts were not on money or potential deals that could make him even wealthier. No, he was worried about his son, Stephen. Stephen had always been a spoiled young man, accustomed to luxury and privilege. Alexander Peterson had given him everything: the best education, the best connections, a life without worries. But instead of becoming the responsible person his father had hoped for, Stephen chose a path filled with excess, endless parties, and poor decisions. Not a week went by without Alexander hearing about some scandal involving his son. That morning, a phone call had finally pushed him over the edge. Stephen had organized yet another of his extravagant parties, this time in a large house he had rented for the event. Excessive alcohol, unruly guests, and the news that some of his friends had damaged property were the last straw for his father's patience. Alexander took a deep breath, clenching his fists. "This can't go on," he muttered to himself. He knew he had to act decisively. But this time it would be different. It was no longer enough to simply scold Stephen or freeze his account for a few days. No. This time, his son needed to learn a life lesson. Mr. Peterson," his assistant, a businesslike and composed woman, interrupted. "Your son is here." Alexander turned slowly, his face tense with the decision he had made. "Let him in," he said firmly. Stephen entered the office in the same carefree manner as always. He wore dark sunglasses that couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes after a night of partying. "So, what's it now? More of your lectures?" Stephen said sarcastically, settling into the chair opposite his father's desk. Alexander Peterson stared at him silently for a few seconds. Stephen had always managed to downplay everything as if the consequences didn't affect him. But this time would be different. "Stephen, this is no longer a game. You have crossed the line too often. It's over. Your life cannot continue like this. You're 27 years old and you don't even know what it means to earn a living through honest work," Alexander began in a low voice. Stephen sighed, rolling his eyes. "Seriously? Another one of your motivational speeches? Because if it is, I don't have time for this." Alexander leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "No, this time it's different. I've made a decision. And trust me, you'll like it less than you think." Something in his father's tone caught Stephen's attention, causing him to frown. "What do you mean by that? Are you getting married?" Stephen laughed. "Married? Are you crazy? I'm not marrying anyone. I have neither the time nor the desire." Alexander didn't blink. "You are marrying Katie. Who is Katie?" "Katie is a simple, hard-working girl, a farmer. She lives in the countryside, a woman with real values. You will marry her and live with her on her farm. This will be your new life." Silence fell in the office. Stephen stood up abruptly, his eyes full of disbelief. "What are you talking about? You can't make me marry some farmer. Do you really think I'll agree to this?" "You no longer have a choice, Stephen. Either you accept this or you have nothing. I'm tired of your games, your excesses. This marriage is the only way to save you from yourself." Stephen clenched his fists, feeling a hot wave of anger wash over him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You can't do this to me. This is madness. I can, and I will. Everything is already decided. In a week, you will marry Katie, and after that, you will start living a real life. No more parties, luxuries, just hard work and responsibility." Stephen looked at his father with fury, but Alexander Peterson's expression was unwavering. He was firm, and Stephen understood there was no turning back this time. Stephen left the office, feeling the world's weight on his shoulders. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Marry a farmer. How could his father be so cruel, so tyrannical? His life was about to turn into complete madness, all because of his father's whim. "He's definitely gone mad, that old man," Stephen thought. On the way home, Stephen was consumed by his thoughts. There was no way that he, Stephen Peterson, heir to one of the most influential families in the country, would end up married to a woman he didn't even know. "This is just insane," he muttered, pressing the gas pedal, feeling the anger fill his chest. At home, he headed straight to his minibar and poured himself a whiskey. Neat. "This can't be happening," he repeated to himself, over and over, taking a sip. "My father has lost his mind." Stephen's phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from one of his friends inviting him to a new party. But what used to bring Stephen joy now seemed meaningless. He knew his usual life was over. There was no way out. If he didn't listen to his father, he would lose everything. Stephen sank heavily onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm the storm of thoughts tormenting him. "What if I just refuse?" he asked himself. But he knew his father. Alexander Peterson was not a man who made empty threats. If Stephen didn't comply with his demands, everything he had would disappear from his life. "Damn it," he shouted, throwing the glass against the wall and watching it shatter into tiny pieces. The sound of breaking glass filled the silence of his luxurious apartment. But despite all his anger, Stephen knew he had no other options. His life, his luxurious apartment, his sports car, everything depended on whether he fulfilled his father's whim. And the worst part was that his father wasn't going to back down. Over the next few days, Stephen tried to find a way out, consulting with lawyers and close friends. He wanted to save what he had, at least take the car and leave the city, or better yet, leave the country, sell the car, and live off the money for a while. But it all came down to one thing. His father controlled the entire family fortune, all the movable and immovable property. And if Stephen didn't go through with this marriage, he would lose access to everything. No lawyer wanted to go against Alexander Peterson. Finally, on a warm Friday evening, Stephen appeared in his father's office again. This time, his usual arrogant demeanor was gone. He knew that any resistance was futile. "So, what have you decided?" Alexander Peterson asked, not lifting his eyes from the documents on his desk, as if his son's answer didn't matter, which it didn't. Stephen gritted his teeth. His pride resisted submitting to the humiliation, but there was no other way. "I'll do it," he replied dryly, knowing it was a bad idea. Alexander Peterson finally looked up, observing his son with a mix of satisfaction and indifference to his feelings. "A wise decision, son. This marriage is the best thing that could happen to you. Although you don't understand it now." Stephen felt a dull rage rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain silent. There was no point in arguing. His father had already decided everything. "The wedding will take place next Saturday," Alexander Peterson continued, returning his attention to the documents on the desk. "No extravagance, just the essentials. Then you will move to the countryside with Katie and start your new life." The words "new life" echoed in Stephen's mind like a heavy bell. There was nothing more terrifying for him than the thought of leaving everything he had for a life he couldn't even imagine. "And who is she, anyway?" Stephen asked, irritably. Alexander Peterson looked at him like he was an insignificant speck. "Katie is everything you're not. Hardworking, responsible, and wise. She's exactly what you need in life. Maybe if you learn something from her, you'll finally become the person I always hoped to see in you." Stephen didn't respond, knowing that any words would only make things worse. But inside him, a slow burning hatred for his father was growing. He left the office silently, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on his shoulders. In a week, his life would change forever. But Stephen didn't yet know that this marriage, which he viewed as a sentence, would so profoundly shake his life principles. The day finally arrived. With a mixture of disbelief and resignation, Stephen drove to the farm where Katie lived. He sat in the back seat of his car, and as the cityscape gave way to endless fields, his thoughts kept returning to the same thing. This is impossible. This can't be real. But it was reality, and with each mile that took him away from the city, he got closer to a life he considered impossible. The car stopped in front of a modest but well-kept house. The facade was simple, with a small garden full of flowers that Katie had planted with her own hands, though Stephen didn't know this yet. The contrast with his luxurious city life was almost comical. Getting out of the car, Stephen looked around with disdain. "This is my future," he thought with a grimace, and sighed heavily. Katie came out to meet him with such calm confidence that it threw Stephen off balance. She was a young woman, very beautiful, with a determined look, someone who was accustomed to hard work. She wore simple clothes, without expensive makeup or the sophisticated dresses Stephen was used to, but there was an undeniable beauty in her naturalness. "Hi, Stephen," she said quietly, extending her hand in a gesture of greeting. Stephen looked her up and down, not hiding his disdain. This was the person he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with. A simple farmer who knew nothing of luxury or sophistication. However, swallowing his pride, he extended his hand and shook hers lightly, showing no interest. "I suppose you already know why I'm here," Stephen said, with a certain indifference. "This wasn't my idea. My father forced me, so I'm here against my will." Katie looked at him directly, but didn't succumb to his coldness. She already knew everything about Stephen, about his city life, the parties, and the chaos he created. For her, this marriage was a sacrifice she was willing to make for her family and the farm which couldn't survive without outside help. "I know," Katie replied, not averting her gaze. "Neither of us wants this, but it's been decided." Stephen felt uneasy at Katie's calmness. He had expected to meet a submissive girl resigned to her fate, but Katie clearly didn't fit that image. There was a quiet strength in her that unsettled him. "Yeah, this is the life waiting for me," Stephen said, looking around with a grimace. "I guess my father thinks I need this." "You don't have to stay if you don't want to," Katie responded simply with such honesty that it disarmed him for a moment. "I'm not going to force you to do anything. You're also not of interest to me." Stephen looked at her in confusion. He hadn't expected such a reaction. She should have been grateful. After all, he was Stephen Peterson, the son of a wealthy man. How could she dare to speak to him so directly? "Looks like I'll have to get used to this," he finally replied, shoving his hands in his pockets. "This life is not for me. But if my father wants it, I'll endure." "It's not about what your father wants or doesn't want," Katie gently interrupted him. "It's about what we can build together and how we can change your mindset if you decide to try." Stephen fell silent, not knowing how to respond. He wasn't used to someone challenging him in this way, especially not a woman like Katie. "Well, let's see how it goes," he finally said. Katie said nothing more. She invited him into the house and showed him the place which, to Stephen's surprise, would now be his new home. The walls were adorned with family photos, pictures that told stories of sacrifice and hard work, things that were completely foreign to Stephen. As they walked through the house, Stephen couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort. Everything here seemed too simple, too ordinary. But deep down, there was something about this place that unsettled him. Maybe, he thought for a moment, this life wasn't so bad after all. But he quickly dismissed the thought. He wasn't ready to accept this reality. At the end of the tour, Katie left him alone in his new room. Stephen sat on the bed, looking around the room. His entire life had changed in a matter of days, and now he found himself trapped in a world he didn't understand with a woman he barely knew. The next morning, when Stephen opened his eyes, the sun was just beginning to peek through the windows of his new room. The village's quiet enveloped him, a stark contrast to the noisy hum of the city he was used to. Only the roosters crowed loudly, irritating Stephen. He sat up slowly, realizing that today was unlike any other day. Today, he was supposed to marry a woman he barely knew and certainly didn't love. The reality hit him with unexpected force, like a slap in the face. The wedding was planned as a simple ceremony, far from the pomp and glamour that usually surrounded such events in his previous life. There were no celebrity guests, no halls decorated with exotic flowers. Everything was to take place in a small village church with a few neighbors that Katie had invited. For Stephen, this wedding was a symbol of his defeat before his father, and with every thought of it, his hatred for the situation only grew. At the appointed hour, Alexander Peterson arrived in the village, impeccably dressed as always. Unlike Stephen, who wore a modest suit bought at his father's request from a market, Alexander watched his son from a distance with a cold, satisfied smile. He had won. His son had finally submitted, and although this situation was awkward for everyone, Alexander was confident it was the only way to set Stephen straight. The small church was filled with village residents, people who had known Katie since childhood and deeply respected her. To them, Stephen was an outsider. Many whispered among themselves, wondering how such a hard-working and devoted girl like Katie could marry someone whose reputation in the city was far from ideal, this spoiled young man. Stephen stood at the altar with a frown on his face, while soft music played in the air, filling the church. As the minutes dragged on, his body grew tense. He didn't want to be there. Everything inside him screamed to run away, get in the car, and disappear. But he knew that would only make things worse. His father would destroy him if he tried to run. When the church doors opened, all eyes turned to Katie. She walked to the altar with such calm determination that it drew everyone's attention. She wore a simple white dress, without ornate decorations, but her natural elegance was incomparable. Her head was held high, but her eyes reflected a mix of emotions. Though she accepted this marriage, she knew it wasn't what she had dreamed of. However, her determination to move forward was stronger than her doubts. Stephen couldn't take his eyes off Katie, feeling a mix of awkwardness and curiosity. Despite the absurdity of marrying a girl he knew nothing about, something inside him compelled him to follow her every step, as if he sensed that this day would mark the beginning of something new and necessary for him. When Katie finally approached, the church fell silent. The priest began the ceremony with customary formality, but Stephen could barely hear his words. His mind was far away, stuck between anger at his father and the frustration of being forced into this marriage. "Stephen Peterson, do you take Katie to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the priest asked, snapping Stephen out of his thoughts. Stephen blinked, feeling as though the world around him had frozen. He looked at Katie, who watched him with a calmness he couldn't understand. He knew there was no turning back, that his answer would define his life from this moment on. "Yes, I do," he finally said, tense but firm. The priest turned to Katie and asked the same question, and she responded without hesitation. "I do." From that moment, they were irrevocably bound together. Stephen felt trapped, unable to escape, while Katie, although maintaining her composure, also felt the weight of the commitment she had taken on. There was no love between them, only an agreement imposed by circumstances beyond their control. After the ceremony, Alexander Peterson approached Stephen and Katie with an expression that left no room for doubt. He had achieved his goal. His son was married, bound to a life Alexander deemed suitable for correcting his mistakes. Stephen barely glanced at his father. He knew his father was pleased, and that only fueled his internal resentment. "I hope you'll start living like a real man now," Alexander said firmly. Stephen said nothing, remaining silent as he watched Katie say goodbye to the neighbors who had come to the wedding. For him, this marriage was a prison, but for Katie, despite her doubts, it was a chance for stability and an opportunity to support her family and farm. When they returned to Katie's home, the day seemed incredibly long. Stephen sat in the living room, while Katie, as usual, went to prepare something in the kitchen. They both remained silent, saying nothing, as if the reality of what had happened had not yet fully sunk in. Stephen looked around, realizing that this was now his new home. The next morning, waking up again to the sound of roosters crowing, he felt a strange sensation. He missed the familiar noise of the city. Here everything was quiet, with only the birds and the wind creating a barely noticeable background. He sat up in bed and looked around. Too simple. There was no luxurious furniture or decorations he was used to. He remembered that today was his first full day on the farm. In the new home, he had been forced to accept against his will. Weeks passed after the wedding. Despite Stephen's efforts to get used to his new life, each morning on the farm pressed on him more heavily. The constant physical labor, the lack of the comfort he was used to, and the vibrant city life he once enjoyed had become a burden for him. He tried to pretend he was coping, but the internal tension grew. Katie noticed how Stephen became more and more distant. Although he tried to help with the household, his mood worsened each day. Stephen felt trapped, and one morning when Katie went to work in the field, he made a decision. He knew he couldn't stay on the farm any longer. He needed freedom. He longed to return to the city where he felt truly alive. Quickly packing a few belongings into a backpack, Stephen left a short note on the kitchen table. "Sorry, Katie, but I can't." With these words, he headed to the nearest road to hitchhike back to the city. Stephen found refuge with his old friends in the city center. They were happy to see him and didn't ask too many questions. Together, they continued the lifestyle Stephen knew and loved. Parties, nightclubs, luxury apartments. For a few days, it seemed like he had finally returned to his old life. But inside, his anxiety continued to grow. In the evenings, when the city's noise quieted down, he found himself thinking more and more about leaving Katie and the farm. The conflict inside him raged. He had run away from the rural life, but the feeling of lost peace did not go away. Meanwhile, Katie returned from work to find the note and didn't know what to do. She had sensed this might happen, but didn't expect Stephen to run away so suddenly. However, she didn't complain to anyone, understanding that it was his choice. But Alexander Peterson couldn't simply leave things as they were. When he learned of his son's escape, his face hardened with anger. For him, it was not just his son's action. It was an insult to his authority and the decisions he had made for his son's salvation. Alexander immediately contacted the right people, and soon his son was found. Stephen was hiding at his friend's elite apartments, where noisy parties went on almost round the clock. One evening, when Stephen returned to his friend's place after yet another night out, he was met by a guest. His father sat on the couch in the apartment, his expression full of fury. "Did you really think you could run away?" his father said coldly, rising from his seat. Stephen froze in place. He didn't expect his father to find him so quickly. His internal conflict only deepened. Part of him wanted to return, but pride wouldn't let him admit his mistakes. "I don't have to live the life you chose for me," Stephen replied sharply, though his voice trembled. "You do," Alexander said firmly. "I gave you everything, and you can't just destroy it all. You need to understand how much effort it took to get all this." "You're destroying my life. You made me marry a woman I didn't even know, and now you want me to become a farmer?" "That's not who I am," Stephen yelled with anger. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes sparkling with rage. "You're no longer a child, Stephen. You need to take responsibility for your life. You've been hiding behind money and parties for too long. It's time to become a man." His father grabbed his shoulder and forcefully dragged him to the car, ignoring his protests. Stephen tried to resist, but his father was determined. He knew that if he didn't take action now, his son would be lost for good. Without further words, they drove back to the village. When they arrived at the farm, Katie was already home. She had known Stephen would return, but she didn't expect to see him so soon and in such a state. Alexander led his son inside, like a prisoner, with a look that said, "This conversation would be decisive." "You're staying here now," Alexander said, gripping his son's shoulder tightly. "You made the decision to marry. You accepted this life, and now you will fight for it." Stephen, feeling broken and exhausted, couldn't respond. He looked at Katie, who silently watched the scene. There was no judgment in her eyes, only calm and understanding. Stephen suddenly realized that he hadn't run away from her, or the farm, but from himself. "Leave us," Katie quietly asked Alexander. Alexander looked at her and nodded. He was ready to give his son a second chance, but didn't want to interfere anymore. He left, leaving Stephen and Katie alone. The room was filled with tense silence. Stephen felt empty. He knew he had done wrong, but he couldn't find the words to explain. "I can't," he finally whispered, lowering his head. Katie approached him and said softly, "You didn't run away from me, Stephen. You ran away from your life. But now you have a choice. To take this as a chance for a new life, or to keep running from yourself? Stephen looked up at her, seeing something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before. Katie wasn't an enemy. She wasn't an obstacle in his path. She was the one who understood his internal struggle. "I don't know how to handle this," Stephen admitted. "And no one knows at the beginning," Katie replied, with a soft smile. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." Stephen sighed and covered his face with his hand. He realized that maybe this farm, this life wasn't his punishment, but his salvation. The next morning, waking up, Stephen slowly got out of bed, feeling the discomfort from the hard mattress, and then stepped out onto the porch. In the distance, he saw Katie, already up and working in the field. She was dressed in simple clothes, her hair tied back in a ponytail. Stephen noticed how confidently she moved among the workers, and it puzzled him. She was completely different from the women he met in the city, those who dressed in brands and who never touched hard labor. Watching her, Stephen couldn't help but think that despite his hatred for the situation, Katie was full of a strength that both frightened and attracted him. She was confident and completely at ease, as if all this was natural for her. He couldn't say the same about himself. Deciding not to stay in the house, Stephen walked around the farm. People were working, some with animals, others harvesting crops. Everyone was busy, each in their place, and no one paid attention to him, the outsider in this village. Stephen felt completely out of place here. Climbing a small hill that overlooked the entire farm, Stephen sat on a large rock and thought. The view from the hill was expansive. He saw Katie again, already milking a cow, calmly and confidently doing her work, not needing anyone's help. Stephen watched her with a respect that was gradually breaking through his disdain. She was different. In the evening, they sat across from each other at dinner, saying nothing. Stephen pushed his fork around his plate, not feeling particularly hungry. "It's not like the city here," Katie said, unexpectedly. Stephen looked up, slightly surprised by her tone. There was no reproach in her voice, no hint of irritation, just a calm statement of the obvious. "No," he replied dryly, adding with sarcasm, "It's definitely not." "I know this isn't what you wanted," Katie continued, "but you don't have to see it as a punishment. People here work hard for what they have. Maybe you should try looking at it differently?" Stephen smirked, not knowing how to respond to her words. For him, this life would always be a step backward, but something in her words made him think, if only for a moment. The following days passed similarly. Katie got up early and performed the daily tasks around the farm, and Stephen became increasingly aware that he had nowhere else to go. Sometimes he tried to do something, but his clumsiness and inexperience quickly became apparent, and the farm workers didn't hide their surprise at his incompetence. They didn't mock him, but Stephen felt completely out of place among them. One day, Katie approached him while he was unsuccessfully trying to fix a fence. "If you want to live here, you'll have to learn different tasks," she said calmly. Stephen looked at her in bewilderment. Did she expect him to become a handyman, or even better, a hay cutter? It seemed absurd to him. "And what do you think I should start with?" he asked irritably. "The basics," she replied with a slight smile. "There's a lot of work, but it's not as hard as it seems. If you want, I can teach you." Feeling his pride telling him to refuse, Stephen couldn't ignore her offer. There was no mockery or disdain in her voice, just a genuine desire to help. "All right," he finally agreed, though there was still tension in his tone. Katie nodded and began explaining the simplest task to him. At first, Stephen was clumsy and disinterested, but gradually he began to get into the swing of things. Physical work, though tiring, distracted him from his thoughts and forced him to focus on something real. Weeks passed, and life on the farm took on an unexpected rhythm for Stephen. Although he still resisted his new reality, his hatred gradually waned. There was something calming about this life, something that made him feel less lost. He still avoided interacting with the workers and Katie, but he was slowly getting involved in farming. Despite his clumsiness, Stephen began to understand how this life worked. One day, Stephen was struggling to fix a fence trying to fit a board, but failing to do it right. An old man, a longtime worker on the farm, approached him. Looks like you need some help, young man, Sam said kindly, watching Stephen's awkward attempts. Stephen wanted to do it himself, to show Katie that he wasn't useless, but he had to agree to the help. Yeah, I'm not very good at this, Stephen admitted with a slight smirk. No one was a master the first time, the old man replied calmly, and quickly fixed what Stephen had thought impossible. In a few minutes, the fence was repaired. Thanks, Stephen finally said. For the first time in a long time, he felt respect for someone else's work. Sam patted him on the shoulder and left, leaving Stephen alone, contemplating how little he knew about life outside the city. People here worked not for luxury, but simply to survive. Their work was deeply sincere and genuine, and Stephen began to understand that. Later, at dinner, he decided to speak to Katie not just out of formality. He sat at the small kitchen table, watching her cook with the same skills she displayed on the farm. I fixed the fence today, he said unexpectedly, hoping Katie would be impressed. Katie paused for a moment, surprised that Stephen had spoken first. How did you manage that? She asked, continuing to chop vegetables. Well, not by myself, he admitted with a slight smile. The old man helped. Apparently, I'm not as good as I thought. Katie smiled and replied, Everything comes with experience, she said gently. The important thing is to try. Stephen fell silent again, but his mind was buzzing with thoughts. He expected Katie to laugh or scold him for his clumsiness, but she never did that. Instead, her words were always simple and sincere. It amazed him. The days continued to pass, and though Stephen still felt like an outsider on the farm, he was gradually getting involved in its life. Slowly he began to understand the people who worked here better. All of this had once seemed so foreign to him, but now it was becoming more and more understandable. One evening, as the sun set on the horizon, Katie paused for a moment, gazing at the sunset. She had worked all day in the fields, and now that the work was done, she stood admiring nature. Stephen, standing nearby, saw her. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to enjoy the moment. The sunset was indeed beautiful, unlike the ones he was used to seeing in the city, where sunsets were hidden behind skyscrapers. Here on the farm, it was real, natural, and simple. Beautiful, Katie suddenly said, continuing to look at the horizon. Stephen nodded. He couldn't remember the last time he had paid attention to something as simple as a sunset. Yes, beautiful, he quietly agreed. Katie glanced at him but said nothing. She saw that something in Stephen was beginning to change. It wasn't love, at least not yet. But there was something more between them than just obligations imposed by circumstances. Months passed, and Stephen's life on the farm found a certain routine. He wasn't just idling anymore. He actively helped with the work. Even though he did it without enthusiasm, he still worked. Work on the farm became less of a chore and more of an opportunity for Stephen to distract himself from his thoughts. Gradually, Stephen began to feel a kind of satisfaction from the work he did. It was a strange feeling he had never experienced while living in luxury. One evening, after a long day of work, Stephen returned to the house and saw that Katie was already preparing dinner. Usually, they sat at the table in silence, but this time, Stephen decided he wanted to help. He took a knife and started chopping vegetables next to her, saying nothing. Katie looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. In the silence, an understanding developed between them. They were no longer just two strangers forced to live together. Something more real was beginning to build between them. I never thought I'd be doing this, Stephen said with a slight smile, looking at the vegetables. Cutting vegetables or living in the countryside? Katie asked with a smile. Both, he admitted, but I guess life has a way of surprising you. Katie nodded, continuing to cook, but there was a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. She knew Stephen was changing, and it was a positive change. After dinner, Stephen went for a walk around the farm. This had become his ritual. Evening walks helped him reflect on his life. He still felt out of place here, but more and more he noticed how his old desires and habits were fading into the background. One evening, after an especially hard day, Katie suddenly spoke. Stephen, she said, clearing the table after dinner, you've changed. You're not the same person who arrived here a few months ago." Stephen looked up, surprised by her words. "You think so?" He smirked. "Yes," Katie said firmly. "You've become different. You care about the people here, you work, and you help." Stephen pondered this. Maybe he had indeed changed, and his father's crazy idea had actually been beneficial. "I used to think the world revolved around me and my pleasures, but here I've started to see that life is much more complex, and yet simpler. Everything here has meaning." Katie listened quietly. She didn't need grand words, but her eyes showed that she understood what he was saying. They sat together, feeling their bond grow stronger each day. One day, while working in the field, Stephen suddenly stopped and looked at Katie. "Katie, have you ever thought about living differently?" he asked. Katie turned to him, looking puzzled. "What do you mean?" she asked, not understanding his question. "I mean, maybe we could change something. We could find a balance between this world and what I had before," he suggested, for the first time openly talking about the future. Katie remained silent for a few seconds, thinking about his words. "You're saying you're not ready to stay here forever?" she finally asked. Stephen lowered his head, not knowing how to answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm starting to appreciate this life. But I think we could balance life on the farm and in the city." Katie smiled. Her gaze was full of understanding. She knew Stephen was between two worlds and understood that he needed time to find his path. "Maybe you're right," she finally said. "Maybe there's room for both of our worlds." This conversation marked the beginning of their joint discussion about the future. Stephen and Katie gradually grew closer to each other. Life on the farm brought them together not just as people forced to live together, but as partners supporting each other. Stephen began to understand more and more the value of the life Katie had offered him. They started spending time not only working, but also having long conversations about the future. Over time, a genuine affection developed between them which grew into love. Several months passed, and one day, Katie, nervously, shared important news with Stephen. "Stephen," she said, slowly approaching him, "I need to tell you something." Stephen looked at her with slight anxiety. "Did something happen?" he asked, sensing that there was something important in her words. "I'm pregnant," Katie said, smiling, but there was nervousness in her eyes. For a moment, Stephen froze. He didn't expect such news, but then a genuine smile appeared on his face. "Are you serious?" he asked, hugging Katie. "We're going to be parents." Though Stephen was happy, he realized that life with a child would be challenging, and now he knew he had to try harder. A couple of days later, Alexander Peterson returned to the farm. This time, his visit wasn't as tense as the first. He wanted to see how his son was doing and hear about the progress he had made. Alexander had always been a man of strong character and rarely showed his emotions, but this visit was special. From Katie's words, he knew his son had changed, but he wanted to see it for himself. When Alexander got out of the car, Stephen met him at the gate. They exchanged silent looks and tension hung in the air. Both knew this conversation would be important. "So, how's this life treating you?" Alexander asked, looking at his son. Stephen paused for a moment. "This place has changed me," he finally admitted. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I ended up here." Alexander, though surprised, didn't show his feelings. He knew his plan had worked, but he also understood that the result had exceeded his expectations. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied dryly, hiding his emotions. "I always knew this life would teach you a lot." Stephen smirked, but there was more gratitude than sarcasm in his smile. He understood that his father, despite all his methods, genuinely wanted to help him. They went inside for lunch, and as they sat at the table, Alexander Peterson noticed a sense of unease in Katie. She was nervous. "Katie, did something happen? What has Stephen done now?" his father asked worriedly. "Everything's fine." "We just have some news for you," Katie said with a smile. Alexander frowned, but there was curiosity in his gaze. "What news?" he asked, slightly cautiously. Katie took Stephen's hand and nervously said, "We're expecting a child, and you're going to be a grandfather." Alexander froze. For a moment he couldn't say anything. He had been so focused on changing his son and putting him on the right path that he had never thought about his family expanding. The idea of grandchildren had seemed like a distant dream to him. A child, he slowly repeated, looking from Stephen to Katie. His stern expression softened, and a rare, genuine smile appeared on his face. Well, that's really good news. I never dreamed of this. I'm incredibly happy. Alexander approached his son and hugged him. You surprise me, son, Alexander said, so I'm not without a gift either. Stephen looked at his father in surprise. What gift? You've shown that you've become mature and capable of managing your life. That's why I've decided to give you a share of the business. Now you're not just my son, you'll be my partner. You need to learn to earn your own living, and I'll help you if needed. Stephen was stunned. This wasn't just a gift, it was a chance to start a new life, to take responsibility for his family and future. I don't know what to say, he began, feeling a mix of gratitude and anxiety. It's a huge responsibility. Alexander put his hand on his shoulder and said, I'm confident you'll manage. You've already proven that you can work and take responsibility. Now, you need to show that in business. Stephen and Katie moved to the city, where Stephen started managing the business. They began building their new life in a new home, but never forgot about the farm. Every weekend, they returned to spend time in seclusion, away from the city's hustle and bustle. Over time, Stephen and Katie had a daughter. It was a moment of true happiness when they realized that their family was now complete. Katie cared for their daughter, and despite the complexities of managing the business, Stephen did his best to secure their future. At first, Stephen struggled with his new responsibilities. Managing the firm turned out to be much more challenging than he had anticipated. He faced financial and organizational issues that demanded constant attention. Sometimes he felt overwhelmed, but his father was always there to support him and offer valuable advice. His father taught him how to make tough decisions, manage a team, and be a true leader. Stephen gradually began to understand what it meant to be responsible for something more significant than just himself. Years passed. Stephen became a successful manager, and the business he inherited from his father thrived. He became a true professional, capable of solving complex problems on his own. But despite his business success, the most important thing to him was always his family. Every weekend he, Katie, and their daughter returned to the farm, which had become a symbol of their love and new life. Now Stephen had a life he could be proud of, balancing the city and rural lifestyle, career, and family. He learned to appreciate both the business world and the simplicity of life in nature. Alexander Peterson, seeing how his son had grown, knew that all his efforts had not been in vain. Stephen had become not only a successful businessman, but also a respectable person who had found his path. Though the journey had been difficult and full of trials, together, Stephen, Katie, and their daughter looked to the future with confidence and joy. Thank you for listening to the story. Don't forget to share your thoughts on the story. Subscribe to Moonlit Stories channel, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story coming soon to your screen. We're truly grateful for having you with us. See you soon.